and many thanks to the comrades of the Left Party platform within Left Unity to invite me to this meeting. I'm very happy to be with you. I suppose that the reason explaining my presence here, I'm indeed the only non-British speaker on this platform, is that somehow Syriza is the success story of the radical left in Europe, which puts a kind of extra burden, as you understand, on my shoulders. I'll try to make a kind of sober assessment of the Greek situation and provide some elements for the understanding both of the reasons of that success, which is real, but also an understanding of the specific context in which it happened and perhaps where the things go now. As you know, the success story, to cut a long story short, is illustrated by the fact that last year, in the elections of last year, Syriza only narrowly lost the election. It is the main opposition force in Greece with 27%, and this of course reflects the tectonic, seismic change that happened in the political landscape of the country after 2.5 years of the followed shock therapy that started in 2010. And indeed, I think that's the characteristic of the Greek situation. It's the crisis is, of course, a general capitalist crisis which has hit across Europe. However, the extent of that crisis in Greece has something singular about it. It is much deeper, its consequences are much more dramatic, actually something unseen in Europe since the 1930s, and it's only in Greece that this economic and social crisis developed into a full-scale political crisis, which meant that the old political system has been almost completely destroyed, and a dramatically new political landscape has emerged, a much more polarized one, reflecting a much more polarized situation within society, with a strong radical left on the one hand, a conservative, reactionary, right-wing bloc, actually, which now rules the country in power, and a strong neo-fascist party, about which a lot has been, of course, said in the very last period. We can come back to that in the discussion. What I want to show very briefly now is the fact that the reasons of that success, just as a reminder, 4 years ago in 2009, Syriza got 5% of the vote in the elections of last year, which was its average, let's say, electoral performance of the last decade. So, to explain somehow this situation now from the point of view of what in Syriza made that possible, I would mention three elements. The first is that since the start of the crisis, Syriza had a very principled opposition to that shock therapy, which the key term in Greece is the memorandum. And the memorandum are these agreements signed by the Greek governments in 2010 and then in 2011 with the Troika, which means the European Union, the European Central Bank and the IMF, and which have set the framework for that shock therapy and extra hard, tough kind of austerity politics that has been followed since. The reason that this opposition is appeared as credible in Greek society, I think, has to do with something that pre-existed the crisis, and that is the fact that since many years, actually, Syriza has succeeded in appearing as a principled opposition to any form of neoliberal policies, which means including the social liberal variant of that policies, the type of neoliberal policies which have been implemented, supposedly in a softer way, by social democratic parties, PASOK in the case of Greece. The second reason that explains the success, I think, is that Syriza, because of the way it relates to social movements and to what's happening within society, was in a position to understand, to listen, and to intervene positively in the social protest and in the movements that have developed since the start of the crisis. As you know, in about 2 years, in 2010, 2011, early 2012, Greece has seen something like 24 general strikes, big movements taking to the streets, the main squares of the big Greek cities being occupied for more than a month in the spring of 2011. That enormous social anger combined traditional characteristics of social movements with, as I mentioned before, strikes, trade unions playing an important playing an important role, and completely new, innovative type of movements, comparable to what we have seen elsewhere, of course, in Europe and beyond Europe. Think about the Spanish movement of the squares, or even what happened in the Arab Spring, but which, however, are very innovative and very new for the standards of Greek social protest. And Syriza was able to understand and to intervene into this movement because it appeared not as the self-proclaimed vanguard, not as the self-proclaimed leadership of those movements, but as a political force which understands and respects the autonomous dynamic of those movements, understand their need to differentiate themselves from a traditional way of operating, and nevertheless being in a position to be present in those movements, to be internal to those movements, and to offer a sensible political alternative and a sensible political proposal. And I think this is the third and the last point of Syriza's success. I think that, to put it in a very short sentence, Syriza broke with this type of internalized defeat of the radical left in Europe. And that internalized defeat meant that for a whole historical period, for reasons that of course everyone knows, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the way revolutionary experiments have been discredited by the end of the 20th century, the left has internalized that defeat, and the consequence of that was that it didn't want and it didn't consider anymore seizing power in any way, except in a purely perhaps mythological fantasy that somehow a revolution, usually referring to some model of the past, would somehow, by some kind of miracle, happen. But concretely, it was completely disconnected from any proposal of seizing power and giving concrete solutions within a specific political situation. And Syriza precisely broke with that when, in the spring of 2012, it said, we need a political alternative now, because all those movements, all that popular anger has brought down to governments, but has been unable to change anything whatsoever in that shock therapy. So only a political alternative can bring down those policies, put an end to those policies, and open a new way. And in order to do that, we need to unite all the anti-austerity forces of the left and form concretely a common government, a government of all the anti-austerity left. This was a proposal addressed to the Communist Party, which I have to remember, the Communist Party in Greece was the dominant force within the radical left in Greece for the 2 decades, in the 1990s and also in the 2000 years, actually. The situation changed dramatically only in the last elections. And it changed. One of the reasons is that the Communist Party refused that proposal. On the contrary, it rejected without even considering it seriously, and it was very heavily punished for that. It lost half of its electorate within a month's time, actually, from May to June 2017. So I think that this capacity to give hope was a very crucial element to Syriza's success and to what happened in the spring of 2012. I have to stop now. A lot of things have happened since, actually, but we might have a bit of time to come back to these elements in the discussion.